Monica Fielding had never imagined that the decision to buy a house on the edge of a quiet lakeside community would turn into the most dangerous gamble of her life. She was not a dreamer who longed for the suburbs or a sentimental soul searching for an idyllic retreat. She was a professional, a writer who thrived on investigation and who believed that silence and water could help her carve out space to think, research, and compose. The lake stretched endlessly from her porch, the rippling surface reflecting shifting skies, and beyond the far bank lay the line of houses overseen by the Homeowners Association, a body she barely acknowledged when she signed the closing papers. Her property stood technically inside the HOA's boundaries, though her real estate agent assured her the association was lenient and practically ceremonial in this part of the district. Monica trusted the agent only as far as she trusted any salesman, but the paperwork was clean, the price was right, and the solitude was irresistible. The only detail that struck her as odd was the looming silhouette of an old vessel anchored near the communal dock, a barge whose skeletal frame seemed to belong more to a scrapyard than to a peaceful lake. Locals told her it was a historical exhibit, though no one could explain what history it represented. She thought little of it until the first letter slid under her door only a week after she moved in. The letter was printed on thick paper, embossed with the HOA's seal, and its wording was sharp enough to catch her attention. It welcomed her to the neighborhood in a single line before shifting into a stern warning. She was not to approach the pier after dark, not to photograph the ship, and not to interfere in heritage property matters. The phrasing was bureaucratic, yet hostile, as though written by someone who distrusted her without ever having met her. Monica placed it on her desk and tried to laugh it off. As a journalist, she had seen stranger attempts at intimidation, and compared to the government files she once combed through or the evasive officials she confronted during her reporting years, a petty association with delusions of authority seemed almost comical. Still, she noticed how her hands lingered on the envelope longer than necessary, as if her instincts resisted dismissing the warning. She told herself it was nothing, an initiation ritual of sorts, and returned to her work. Her days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and drafting chapters of her book, afternoons for long walks around the lake, evenings for sorting through old notes from previous investigations. She kept her distance from neighbors, not out of rudeness but because she had no energy for shallow pleasantries. The HOA sent occasional flyers about meetings which she ignored, and notices about lawn maintenance standards, which she regarded as suggestions rather than commandments. It was only the barge that disrupted the illusion of peace. Every time she walked by the shore, she saw the rust spreading deeper along its hull, smelled the metallic stench of stagnant water around its base, and heard the creak of chains when the wind picked up. The ship was a corpse kept upright, and yet the association insisted it was a community treasure. At night, the sight became unsettling, the vessel's shadow merging with the black water so that it seemed to hover like a phantom. The storm that sealed her fate began without warning. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, dragging the afternoon light into premature darkness. Wind slashed across the lake, and waves struck the pier with violent rhythm. Monica watched from her porch, unable to look away as the ship groaned under the pressure. Its chains snapped against the dock, taut as bowstrings until a sudden crack pierced the air and one of the mooring lines gave way. The vessel lurched, twisting sideways, and water rushed into the fractured hull. For a brief moment the barge seemed to resist, defying gravity with sheer stubbornness, but then it tilted, dipped, and surrendered to the storm. Monica stood frozen as the heritage exhibit slipped beneath the surface, leaving behind nothing but swirling debris and the roar of the storm. She expected panic, sirens, maybe boats rushing out to rescue what could be saved, but none came. The lake swallowed the barge in silence. The next morning she awoke to find another letter taped to her door. The tone was different this time, colder, accusatory, almost gleeful. It claimed that evidence indicated her interference with the ship's anchoring system, that her presence near the pier on previous evenings suggested intent, and that the association was preparing a lawsuit to recover damages estimated at $900,000. Monica read the figure twice, 3 times, unable to process how a decaying barge could be worth nearly $1 million. Yet the letter was specific. Expert assessments, restoration costs, penalties for destruction of community property. The HOA had already filed the claim. She, a solitary writer with a modest savings account, was suddenly painted as a saboteur capable of orchestrating the deliberate sinking of a ship. Her porch, her lake, her peaceful refuge, all of it now stood as the center of an impending war she had never chosen. When Monica first unfolded the official packet from the county courthouse, she felt a cold weight settle in her chest, the kind that came not from shock but from the recognition of a trap already snapping shut around her. The envelope was thick, its edges sealed with adhesive tape as if someone had wanted to be absolutely certain it reached her intact, and inside she found a summons, a detailed complaint filed by the Homeowners Association, and an intimidating list of exhibits that would allegedly be presented in court. Every line was written in the dry, merciless language of law, but beneath the jargon she read a single message. They were going to destroy her. The accusation was not simply negligence or trespass. It was deliberate sabotage, described in paragraphs that portrayed her as a calculating vandal who had tampered with mooring equipment to engineer the sinking of the vessel. The claim for damages reached an impossible $900,000, and as she traced the figures on the page, she realized that even if she somehow prevailed in court, the cost of defending herself could bankrupt her long before any verdict was delivered. She sat at her desk for hours, the papers spread out before her, unable to tear her eyes from the manufactured narrative. The complaint insisted that she had been seen near the dock in the days before the storm, that she had a known interest in nautical structures, and that her behavior suggested a motive rooted in hostility toward the association's heritage project. It was surreal, almost theatrical, a script written for a play in which she had been cast as villain. The irony, of course, was that Monica had spent her career as a journalist dismantling similar scripts, exposing the lies of officials who used paperwork and procedure to bury the truth. Yet it was different when the weapon was aimed at her. There were no editors to back her, no colleagues to share the burden, no newspaper lawyers standing ready to intervene. There was only her, a solitary homeowner with a dwindling bank account, and an opponent who wielded the machinery of bureaucracy like a cudgel. Her first instinct was disbelief. Surely a judge would see through the absurdity of the claim. The barge had been corroded for years, its steel eaten by rust, its deck warped and leaking, its maintenance neglected by the very board now seeking restitution. How could anyone argue that she, a single woman with no equipment, no motive, and no history of vandalism, had somehow orchestrated a complex act of sabotage? Yet the longer she studied the documents, the less she trusted her optimism. The complaint was not sloppy, it was meticulous. The HOA's attorneys had crafted a timeline that placed her near the pier, cited vague witness reports, and even included photographs, grainy images taken from across the lake, showing her silhouette during evening walks that now served as evidence of reconnaissance. They had built a fortress of paper, and she knew from experience that once such a fortress was erected, courts could be persuaded to treat it as truth until someone tore it down brick by brick. When she finally stepped outside, the air tasted metallic, heavy with the residue of the storm. Across the lake she saw small figures gathered on the far bank, residents huddled near the dock as if attending a funeral. Voices carried across the water, murmurs of loss and anger, and though she could not hear the words clearly, she knew the subject. Already the association was shaping the narrative, feeding neighbors the idea that an outsider, a newcomer, had robbed them of their historic centerpiece. She felt the heat of their glances even from a distance. For years, she had dissected how communities turned against individuals once a convenient scapegoat was provided, but living inside that transformation was another matter entirely. It was not abstract sociology. It was isolation, pressing down on her skin like a tangible weight. That evening, another letter arrived, hand-delivered and slid beneath her door without even the courtesy of a knock. It demanded immediate cooperation, ordering her to attend a special HOA meeting where the incident would be discussed publicly. The phrasing made her laugh bitterly. Discussed publicly meant tried without evidence, condemned without defense. She tossed the paper onto the growing pile on her desk and paced the length of her living room. She could see the strategy forming: bury her in costs, paint her as dangerous, surround her with hostility until she either surrendered her property or broke under the pressure. The barge had been a tool, a sacrificial pawn in a game designed to eliminate her. Whether it sank by accident or design no longer mattered to them. What mattered was that its disappearance provided the perfect excuse to launch an assault. Sleep evaded her that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind rattled the shutters, every sound amplified by exhaustion. Her thoughts chased each other in restless circles. Calculations of legal fees, half-formed outlines of counter-arguments, fragments of investigative instincts urging her to dig into the association's records. She tried to remind herself that she had faced intimidation before, that truth had always been her shield, but alone in the darkness those reassurances felt brittle. The storm outside had passed, but a storm of another kind was gathering, slow and methodical, built not of wind and rain but of signatures and filings, notices and liens. She realized with a kind of grim clarity that the real trial had already begun, and it was not in a courtroom but in the erosion of her resolve. The HOA had cast her as a saboteur, and unless she fought back with everything she had, that label would become the only truth anyone cared to believe. The first formal escalation arrived not in the form of another letter, but in the sudden silence that followed her attempts to request a clarification. Monica, having spent an entire morning drafting a measured email to the HOA's office demanding access to maintenance records of the barge and documentation of any inspections, received nothing in return except an automated acknowledgement. Days passed, then a week, and still no reply. Instead, when she checked her mailbox, she found a notice from the county registrar informing her that a lien had been filed against her property pending the outcome of the civil suit. It was a simple sheet of paper, but it struck with the force of a hammer. Her house, the one place she thought she controlled, was no longer entirely hers in the eyes of the law. The association had seized not just her reputation, but the foundation beneath her feet. Determined not to crumble, she walked into their office in person, a small brick building tucked between a bank and a dentist's practice, with blinds drawn so tightly that the interior seemed perpetually closed to daylight. The receptionist, a young man with the expressionless demeanor of someone trained to offer no information, greeted her only with a flat request for identification. When she presented it, he nodded without looking at her and disappeared through a back door. Minutes dragged into nearly half an hour before the door opened again, revealing not the president, not any board member, but a man in a pressed gray suit who introduced himself as counsel retained on behalf of the association he invited her into. A sterile meeting room, its only decoration a framed photograph of the very barge now lying at the bottom of the lake. The lawyer's tone was courteous, even warm, but every sentence carried a blade hidden within. He explained that her demands for documents were inappropriate during pending litigation, that her presence in the office could be construed as intimidation, and that all communication should henceforth be routed through counsel. When she pressed him, pointing out that she had a right to see maintenance logs as they directly pertained to the accusations, his smile did not falter. He merely slid a copy of the complaint across the table as if to remind her of its weight. "You will have your opportunity to contest these matters in court," he said softly, "but the board is confident in its position." The implication was unmistakable. They held the upper hand, and she was trespassing on their territory by daring to ask questions. Walking back to her car, she felt the eyes of passers-by linger too long. Perhaps it was paranoia, perhaps not, but the sensation gnawed at her. That evening, she noticed the first true sign that her life was being deliberately constricted. A letter from her bank arrived, informing her that her credit line had been suspended pending ongoing litigation risk. The HOA's attorneys had sent copies of their complaint not only to the court but also to her financial institution, ensuring that even her access to borrowed funds would shrink. It was a calculated move. Starve her of resources, weaken her ability to hire counsel, and force her into settlement. Refusing to surrender, she contacted an independent attorney recommended by a distant colleague. The woman's name was Maya Collins, and from the first phone call Monica sensed both competence and unflinching resolve. Maya listened in silence as Monica described the barge, the accusations, the lien, the sudden tightening of her financial leash. When Monica's voice faltered, Maya interrupted only once with a question that cut through everything. "Do you want to fight, or do you want to settle?" Monica, without hesitation, answered that she wanted to fight. Within 48 hours, Maya had filed a motion demanding preservation of all HOA records related to the barge, including communications between board members in the weeks leading up to the storm. The association now knew they had an adversary who would not collapse quietly. The retaliation was swift. Flyers began appearing on neighborhood bulletin boards with carefully worded insinuations about individuals who undermine community heritage. The text never named her, but the timing left no doubt. Children stared as she walked past. Neighbors averted their eyes or closed their doors. At night, she heard footsteps pause outside her porch, followed by silence, as though someone was checking whether she was home. She began double-locking the doors and leaving lights on, though she resented the energy wasted on fear. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a stage on which unseen actors rehearsed intimidation. The breakthrough came not from her own searching, but from Maya's insistence on combing through obscure filings. Among the records submitted by the HOA in response to the preservation motion was a line item dated 2 days before the storm. An invoice for repositioning and assessment of vessel anchoring systems, signed not by a contractor, but by the association president himself, Floyd Wesserman. The language was vague, the description incomplete, but it raised questions. Why would the president personally authorize adjustments to a structure that had been considered untouchable for years? Why had this invoice never been shared with residents? For the first time, Monica saw the possibility that the sinking had not been a tragic accident miscast as sabotage, but a deliberate maneuver planned from within. She stared at the document late into the night, tracing the president's signature with her finger. A surge of grim satisfaction mingled with dread. If the truth was that the ship had been sabotaged deliberately by those now blaming her, then she was not just a target of harassment, but the witness to a fraud far larger than anyone suspected. Yet exposing that truth would demand more than persistence. It would require survival through the onslaught the association was only beginning to unleash. The midpoint of Monica's ordeal unfolded not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet unveiling of a truth so stark that it redefined the entire conflict. By the time the preliminary hearing arrived, she had grown accustomed to the rituals of battle. The ironed suit she wore like armor, the folders of neatly arranged notes she carried even when she suspected they would be ignored, the steady presence of Maya at her side with her unflinching voice and deliberate diction. The courtroom itself was small, lined with pale wood paneling that carried the faint smell of varnish, its windows letting in thin gray light that gave the proceedings a muted atmosphere. Across the aisle sat the representatives of the HOA, 3 board members in carefully chosen attire that projected humility and gravitas, their attorney immaculate in a navy suit that gleamed under the fluorescence. Floyd Wesserman, the president, did not glance in her direction, though Monica felt the weight of his presence as though he were a shadow cast across her bench. The HOA attorney began by presenting their narrative with the confidence of someone who knew repetition could transform speculation into accepted truth. He described Monica as resentful, prone to solitude, harboring animosity toward the association, and possessing enough technical curiosity to have tampered with the barge's mooring systems. He gestured to photographs taken from across the lake, images that showed nothing more sinister than her evening walks yet were presented as reconnaissance missions. He produced a report from a hired inspector who claimed the anchor chain bore signs of manual interference, though the photographs in the report were so blurred that the judge squinted before waving them aside. Monica's pulse quickened at each accusation, but Maya remained steady, taking notes with the calm assurance of someone waiting for the right moment. When their turn arrived, Maya rose without haste, her voice low but firm, and announced that the defense had obtained records directly from the HOA's own files, records that contradicted the story just delivered. She handed the judge a thin folder and explained that 2 days prior to the storm, authorization had been given by Floyd Wesserman himself to alter the anchoring of the vessel. The language of the invoice was deliberately vague, but it indicated that adjustments were carried out without professional oversight. For the first time, the courtroom shifted. Even the board members leaned toward one another, whispering behind raised hands. Floyd's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Maya pressed on, requesting that the court order full disclosure of all internal communications regarding the vessel from the preceding month. The judge, perhaps sensing the unusual weight of the matter, granted the motion. It was a small victory, procedural and technical, but in Monica's chest it felt like the first crack in the fortress wall. Days later, when the documents arrived, they came not as orderly records but as a heap of scanned emails and memoranda, dumped without explanation. Monica and Maya spent nights combing through them, their eyes blurred from the glow of laptop screens, until a thread emerged. One email, time-stamped 3 weeks before the storm, showed Floyd forwarding a maintenance report to another board member with the words, "It will be easier if this relic takes care of itself." Another message warned that the insurance carrier had declined coverage for restoration because the vessel was deemed structurally unsound. Buried deeper was a note from the treasurer, expressing concern that the cost of removing the ship legally would drain the association's reserve fund and trigger resident outrage. The implication was unmistakable. The barge was a liability, a financial burden too heavy to bear, and its destruction would eliminate a problem while opening the door to an inflated insurance claim. The discovery filled Monica with equal parts triumph and dread. Triumph, because the story she had suspected was real. Dread, because the knowledge placed her in direct opposition not just to careless neighbors, but to a coordinated scheme that bordered on fraud. If the president of the HOA had orchestrated the vessel's demise, then she was more than an accused saboteur. She was a threat to people who had already shown their willingness to ruin her life through legal pressure and social isolation. She felt the paranoia sharpen each time she left her house, convinced that eyes followed her from the windows of cars, that conversations hushed when she entered a store. Yet the documents burned like a beacon in her mind. Undeniable proof that the association's narrative was not just mistaken, but deliberately inverted. Maya urged caution, reminding her that evidence must be wielded carefully, that to accuse too soon without airtight proof would allow the opposition to dismiss the revelations as speculation. But Monica's instincts as a journalist rebelled. She wanted to publish, to expose, to drag the truth into daylight before it could be buried again. They compromised. Maya would prepare the material for the next hearing, shaping it into a precise challenge to the association's credibility, while Monica continued gathering context quietly, making sure no piece of the puzzle was missing. The true turning point came when an anonymous envelope appeared in her mailbox, unmarked and sealed with ordinary tape. Inside was a single flash drive, no note, no explanation. Against her better judgment, she opened it, finding a series of video files. The footage was grainy, likely captured from a hidden camera, but the images were clear enough. Floyd Wesserman standing on the deck of the barge 2 nights before the storm, instructing 2 men in work gloves as they loosened the secondary lines. Securing the vessel. His voice carried faintly over the static. Once the weather shifts, it won't take much. Let the lake finish it. Monica watched the clip again and again, her stomach tightening with every repetition. It was not simply negligence, not the lazy oversight of an incompetent board. It was premeditation, the deliberate engineering of a disaster to rid the association of a financial burden and to cast the blame on an expendable scapegoat. She brought the footage to Maya, who examined it with a practiced eye and immediately arranged for a forensic specialist to verify authenticity. Until the expert gave his confirmation, they agreed to keep the material hidden, knowing too well how quickly such evidence could disappear or be discredited. Yet, even before the report arrived, Monica felt the balance of power shift within her. For weeks, she had been the accused, scrambling to shield herself from accusations. Now she held the first undeniable proof that the accuser was in fact the perpetrator. The knowledge did not erase her fear, but it hardened it into resolve. The case was no longer about saving her reputation or her home. It was about exposing a fraud at the heart of the community, a fraud that had already consumed her life and threatened to consume others if left unchallenged. That night, as she sat on her porch, staring across the lake at the dark water concealing the wreck, she realized she was no longer just defending herself. She was preparing to put the president of the HOA on trial, not in the abstract sense of paperwork and motions, but in the very real sense of dragging his actions into the open, where even the neighbors who glared at her would be forced to confront the truth. The midpoint had arrived, and with it the understanding that there was no retreat left. She was committed, fully and irrevocably, to a war she had not chosen, but would now fight to the end. The second escalation began the moment Monica and Maya moved to file the motion that would introduce the hidden camera footage into the court record. Until that point, the association's strategy had been aggressive but predictable, limited to financial strangulation and reputational assault. Yet, as soon as Floyd Wesserman and his attorneys learned that their narrative was under threat, the HOA atmosphere around Monica's life grew darker, as though someone had turned a key and locked her inside a chamber designed to squeeze the air from her lungs. The first sign came through the sudden appearance of anonymous articles in the local newsletter, written under the guise of concerned residents, suggesting that Monica had a history of instability, that her past reporting career had ended not through choice but through disciplinary issues, and that she had always sought conflict wherever she went. The claims were vague, unverifiable, but delivered with the confidence of rumor disguised as fact, and neighbors who had already kept their distance now regarded her with open suspicion, some going so far as to cross the street rather than walk past. Her gait, it did not stop there. Late one evening, as Monica prepared her notes, the power in her house flickered, then cut entirely, leaving her in sudden darkness while the rest of the street remained lit. She lit candles and tried to dismiss it as coincidence until she discovered the next morning that the breaker box had been tampered with, wires loosened in a way no storm could have caused. The violation left her shaken, not because of the damage itself but because of what it implied. Someone had stepped onto her property, touched her walls, and left again without a trace. Maya insisted they document everything, filing a police report, though neither of them believed it would lead to action. The officer who arrived scribbled notes without enthusiasm, muttering that neighbors get heated and that civil disputes spill over sometimes. It was not reassurance but confirmation that the association's influence extended even into the indifference of local enforcement. As the intimidation grew, the courtroom battles sharpened. Floyd's attorney tried to preempt the introduction of the video evidence by filing a motion to exclude it on grounds of illicit surveillance and potential manipulation, arguing that because the camera's origin was unknown, It could not be considered reliable. Maya countered that its authenticity could be established by experts, that the voices and movements matched Floyd precisely, and that the footage was not entrapment but independent observation. The judge, wary but intrigued, ordered a hearing to determine admissibility. The date was set, and with it came the realization that both sides were now committed to open war. Meanwhile, Monica noticed how the attacks grew more personal. One morning she found her mailbox crammed with glossy pamphlets for bankruptcy services, each bearing her name in bold letters as if mocking the financial ruin that hovered above her. On another day, a dead fish was left on her porch, its scales dull and its stench unbearable, a crude but unmistakable warning. When she walked the path by the lake, children whispered words their parents had clearly fed them. Sinker, wreck witch, troublemaker. She forced herself to keep her head high, but inside the isolation hollowed her out. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like an outpost under siege. Maya, however, thrived under pressure. She dug deeper into the association's financial statements and uncovered patterns that hinted at broader corruption. Inflated contracts awarded to companies connected to board members, maintenance fees funneled through shell organizations, insurance, claims filed for damages that had never occurred. Each discovery added weight to the suspicion that the sinking of the barge was not merely a desperate solution to one liability, but part of a culture of fraud that enriched those at the top while bleeding the community dry. Monica, listening to Maya outline the evidence, realized with a mix of awe and terror that the trial would no longer be about her alone. If they pursued this path, they would be pulling on a thread that could unravel the entire fabric of the association's governance. The escalation reached its peak when a motion was filed by the HOA demanding immediate seizure of her property as security against damages. It was a brazen attempt to strip her of her home before any verdict had been reached, and though Maya managed to block it temporarily, the danger was palpable. Monica walked through her rooms that night with a new awareness, touching the edges of bookshelves, the handles of doors, the window frames, knowing that at any moment the law could be twisted to wrench them from her hands. The lien had been bad enough, but this was the first attempt to dispossess her outright, to make her homeless in the middle of a fight she had not sought. And yet, in the middle of fear, she felt the weight of resolve settle deeper. They would not escalate if they were confident. They would not lash out if they did not sense the ground shifting beneath them. The video, the emails, the invoices, the financial anomalies, all of it formed a mosaic that pointed toward the truth. Floyd Wesserman had orchestrated the sinking of the barge, not out of negligence but out of greed, and now he was cornered. Monica understood that the escalation was proof not of her weakness, but of their fear. Still, fear could be dangerous when it belonged to men with power, and the days leading to the evidentiary hearing promised to test not just her endurance, but her very sanity. She had chosen to fight, and now the war was fully upon her. The courtroom was fuller than Monica had expected, not with reporters, none had been summoned, but with residents whose curiosity outweighed their reluctance to be seen choosing sides. They filled the benches, whispering behind their hands, watching her with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. Monica sat rigid beside Maya, her palms pressed against the polished surface of the defense table, listening as the judge called the hearing to order. The motion at stake was whether the hidden camera footage would be admitted as evidence, yet the atmosphere was charged with a sense that far more was about to unfold. Floyd Wesserman sat across the aisle, his expression carved into calm authority, flanked by attorneys who radiated confidence. But Monica noticed how his fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, a small betrayal of nerves. The HOA's counsel began with a lengthy argument that the footage was tainted, the product of unlawful surveillance, perhaps fabricated, impossible to authenticate. He spoke smoothly, gesturing to legal precedents and technicalities, weaving a net of doubt designed to strangle the clip before it could breathe. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, but when Maya rose to respond, her voice cut through the chamber like glass breaking. She explained that the video had been analyzed by an independent forensic specialist who verified its integrity, that the audio waveform matched Floyd's voice with statistical certainty, and that the timestamp coincided with weather data and security records from nearby docks. Then, with deliberate precision, she requested permission to play a portion of the footage. The judge agreed. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly Floyd's image filled the room, his figure illuminated by a flashlight beam, his voice captured clearly as he instructed two men to loosen the lines. "Once the weather shifts, it won't take much. Let the lake finish it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the skeptical residents leaned forward, their faces pale. Monica felt her chest tighten. Not with fear this time, but with vindication. The raw surge of knowing the truth had finally pierced the facade. Floyd's attorneys scrambled, objecting, calling the clip misleading, but the words had already sunk into the air. Undeniable, unforgettable. Maya did not stop there. She introduced the emails and invoices, laying them out like stepping stones leading directly to Floyd's intent. The insurance denial, the treasurer's warning about costs, Floyd's casual remark that the relic should take care of itself. Each document reinforced the pattern, transforming what had once been suspicion into a narrative of deliberate sabotage. The judge's expression shifted from neutrality to something sterner, more exacting, as though weighing not only the civil matter before him but the shadow of potential criminal conduct. When Floyd was called to testify, he rose with forced composure, his voice measured, denying involvement, claiming the footage had been doctored by enemies who wanted to smear his reputation. But cross-examination unraveled him. Maya pressed relentlessly, asking why his signature appeared on authorizations to adjust the anchoring, why his words in the email matched the phrasing on the invoice, why his presence on the deck coincided with the timeline of the sinking. Each denial sounded thinner than the last, and when the video was replayed at half speed, his voice ringing across the chamber, even his allies on the board looked away. The climax came not in a single dramatic outburst but in the quiet authority of the judge's ruling. He leaned forward, his gavel untouched, and stated that the plaintiff's claims were dismissed with prejudice. The evidence, he declared, indicated that the vessel's destruction was orchestrated internally, and the attempt to blame Monica was an abuse of process bordering on fraud. He referred the matter to the district attorney for review, noting the possibility of criminal charges. The words struck harder than any shout could have. Floyd sat motionless, his face drained of color, while murmurs rippled through the gallery. Monica closed her eyes, allowing herself a single breath of release, the weight of weeks lifting at last. For the first time since the nightmare began, the tide had turned openly in her favor. She was no longer the accused, she was the witness to the truth, and the man who had tried to destroy her now faced ruin of his own making. When the final session ended and the gavel struck for adjournment, Monica walked out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light, her body moving as if through water, every step weighted by exhaustion yet lightened by relief so deep it felt almost unreal. The decision had been made, the accusations dissolved, and for the first time since the storm she could breathe without the invisible hand of the HOA tightening around her throat. Residents lingered on the courthouse steps, some whispering, some staring openly, yet the eyes that once burned with suspicion now flickered with unease, as though each of them understood that they had been complicit, if only through silence, in allowing a lie to take root. She did not look at them. She had no interest in apologies that came only after the truth had become undeniable. In the days that followed, letters arrived not from the association but from the court, confirming that the lien had been lifted, that her property was safe, that she was entitled to compensation for legal costs. Maya pressed her to consider pursuing damages for defamation, but Monica declined. She wanted no further entanglement, no endless rounds of filings and hearings. The verdict had restored her name, and that was enough. Floyd Wesserman resigned from the HOA under pressure of the looming criminal investigation, his polished authority stripped to the bones of a disgraced man, and whispers spread that prosecutors were preparing charges of fraud and conspiracy. The community board announced reforms, promising transparency and oversight. But Monica watched from a distance, unwilling to believe that the machinery of power could change simply because one cog had broken. One evening she returned to the shore where the barge had once loomed, the water calm now, reflecting a sky streaked with late sun. Nothing remained of the wreck except ripples that faded into silence. But as she stood there, she understood that the absence itself had become its own monument. Not to history or heritage, as the HOA had claimed, but to the price of deception and the fragility of truth when it is buried beneath greed. She turned away without nostalgia, without triumph, only with the steady knowledge that she had endured and that endurance was victory enough. The house by the lake was still hers, but she no longer thought of it as a refuge. It had become a marker of survival, a place she had defended when everything conspired to strip it from her. When she finally closed the door that night, leaving the water behind her, she felt not joy but clarity. The war had ended not with celebration, but with quiet survival, and for Monica that was the only ending that mattered.